Okay, so over the weekend I played some games of 4th edition and I just wanted to share my initial impressions of the game. The first thing to note is that the battle tactics change a lot of what I expected about the game. So initially I was thinking with the changes to the priority roll, it would be much less important to go second in the first battle round. And because of that, the low drops would be less important, and because of that, there'd be a whole bunch of sort of downstream list building implications. You'd be very flexible about what you can put in your list. Turns out that's not really the case. Turn 1 is still a really big deal. It's not a big deal because of the double turn though. Certainly when you're going second in the round and you win the priority roll and you look at the battlefield and you're like, I could take a double turn, but giving up the battle tactic really is a big enough incentive that you really don't want to do it unless you're getting a lot of value out of it. And there's not many situations where that's the case. Like when you look at the board and you're like, I could definitely do a battle tactic if I don't take the double turn here, and you know you're giving up those points, I think the double turn is a lot less threatening. The reason you want to go first is because of how the battle tactics line up. Pretty much, there's no good battle tactics for going first in the round. There's no like auto gimme battle tactics, at least on some of the battle plans. On some of them, they're a bit easier to do, but on a lot of the battle plans, your best options are seize the center or take the flanks. And because those are your best options, both of them kind of misposition your army, right? They're not necessarily impossible to do, but if you, for example, if you're doing take the flanks and you got to put a unit on either edge of the board, if you do really small units, it's possible that your opponent, who also may be deployed on those edges, could kill one of those units or could use covering fire to kill one or something like that. So if you use a really cheap unit like Furies or Aether Wings or something like this, just to nab those points right on the edge of the battlefield, then you also have this problem where they're not really strong enough to guarantee that you're going to get the tactic. The other problem is if you spend too many points, you invest too many points, maybe you put 2 units of Chaos Knights or something on the edge, you got like 500 points of your army sitting on the very edge of the battlefield, not necessarily doing anything. So it can put you in a really awkward position. Again, depends a bit on the battle plan. If you deploy 11 on and then there's a big dead zone, it can be a lot easier to do. But if you've got territory all the way up to the middle of the board, it's very hard to do and your opponent has a lot that they can do about it. Or not necessarily, again, not necessarily hard to do, but hard to do without putting your army in a really vulnerable position, especially since your opponent might have a double turn, right? They can still use the double turn and they can still get a lot of value out of it if you miss position. Seize the center is like that, but even worse, right? Putting 2 units in the middle and not being in combat, it's very easy to find yourself in combat, especially in those situations where you deploy quite close to the middle line. Your opponent can get there fairly quickly. There's a few different things they can do to get there. If they can cast a manifestation, for example, and put it right in the middle of the battlefield, then you have to be able to kill that manifestation. So you have to charge into it. And if you're charging into that manifestation, that might also mean that you're within charge range of other units that they put right on the line because they've deployed 9 away from the middle. It really depends on the battle plan, but often your opponent can do something about seize the center as well. So it's not necessarily an automatic battle tactic. And it requires you to put 2 units in the middle. And because you're putting at least 2 units in the middle, and then you're going to have to like move your whole castle up and whatever, your opponent is then on their turn in sort of striking distance of pretty much everything you have. They can move and then they'll be in charge range. So they've got a lot of choice about what things they attack and a lot of choice, especially if they get the double turn, they can destroy a bunch of units on their turn and then push through and destroy a bunch more and cause a decisive amount of damage right there on turn 2. So those 2 battle tactics, they're not necessarily impossible. It doesn't mean that you automatically lose if you get given first. It's just that it's worth avoiding. It certainly gives you a fairly strong list building incentive to avoid going first in the battle round. The other thing the battle tactics do, there's a bit of a tension, is Slay the Entourage. Slay the Entourage is you just pick a unit in the enemy's general's regiment and destroy that unit. This is a really interesting one because your general gets extra units or an extra unit in their regiment. So they have 4 units instead of 3 in addition to the hero that's in the unit, in the regiment. Because of this, when you're building your list, you want low drops so you can give away the first turn, but you also want to put as many units in your regiments so that you can minimize your drops because each regiment is a drop. So two drop lists are going to have a lot of units in the general's regiment. And that means you're going to make that other tactic a lot easier. You're going to have more options for Slay the Entourage. Whereas if you've got a 3-drop list or a 4-drop list, you might have the luxury of putting only 1 unit in your general's regiment. You could even put 0 units in the general's regiment. If you really want to minimize your opponent's chances of getting that battle tactic. But at the same time, you want to take advantage of the honor guard rule. So you probably want 1 unit at least in your general's regiment, and you want that unit to be pretty powerful because the honor guard buff is pretty powerful. So you want to make decent use out of it without giving your opponent an easy target for that Slay the Entourage. Just as a little side note, if you do go down this minimal strategy, you can put a general by themselves just in a regiment. And because there's no more requirement about the general being on the battlefield to get command points or the general issuing commands at 18-inch range or anything like that, you can intentionally get your general killed either during your own turn or during a turn where the opponent has picked a different battle tactic than Slay the Entourage. And then you won't have any units in your general's regiment left alive, so they won't be able to complete that battle tactic. And you can successfully deny them from getting that battle tactic, which is one of the easier ones in a lot of matchups. So I certainly think Slay the Entourage is very warping for list building, and you've got this tension between wanting to build low drops so that you don't have to do seize the center or take the flanks turn 1, and then wanting to go higher drops so that you can minimize the number of units in your general's regiment. There's also a point to make about battle profiles. If you have a War Master, then your War Master is probably going to fulfill 2 conditions at once, which are interesting for Slay the Warlord. Your War Master probably lets you take any units from anywhere in the army. They probably have a really relaxed, really open regiment restriction. And at the same time, they require you to take them as the general. So because of this, in an army like Slaves to Darkness, my lists look like I have 1 like Be'lakor, who's the general, and then a Chaos Sorcerer Lord for my 2nd regiment. And the Chaos Sorcerer Lord can only take Warriors of Chaos, and Warriors of Chaos doesn't include really any of the chaff units in the army. So if I want to take chaff, I really have to put them in Be'lakor's regiment, and that makes it really easy for my opponent to try and achieve those battle tactics to achieve that Slay the Entourage, because there's units whose job is just to sort of die. I do want to experiment with like taking Furies, for example, because Furies have that 3-up retreat ability. When they're in combat, they roll a dice. On a 3-up, they retreat. That is very unreliable. If your opponent wants to kill the Furies with melee, then they have to guarantee that the Furies can't retreat, and they have like a 12-inch flying move. So Furies might be a really good choice for making it slippery to get one of those battle tactics just for cheap. They only have like 6 wounds, and they'll die to any shooting at all, so a lot of armies will be able to deal with them that way, but you never know. There might be these matchups where Furies are actually a really neat unit to include as chaff in the general's regiment that make it hard for your opponent to do Slay the Entourage. All of those things, they're all different from how I thought the game would be before I saw the full set of battle tactics. They really do shift how you build your lists. Another thing that I got wrong was the manifestations. I thought manifestations would be quite weak, especially because I was judging most of the manifestations based off of Quicksilver swords. That was really the first one, and I think the only one we saw for a really long time. Maybe there was a couple in the faction focuses that didn't look too impressive, but the really important ones are Kronspine, Purple Sun, and Ravenek's Gnashing Jaws, the ones that when you banish them, they don't die straight away. That means that you actually need to commit resources to taking them out. They survive a turn of a wizard banishing them, sort of no matter what. The other thing is, I didn't realize there are even more rules that make manifestations better than in 3rd edition. A wizard can cast any number of them. You can only banish during your own turn. I thought you'd be able to banish in both turns, but obviously just not the turn when they get summoned. But yeah, rereading the rules carefully, there's no mention of that. You just can't banish in your opponent's turn. The banish ability is your hero phase. So things like they summon a Kronspine in the middle of the board, it rocks around to my turn, I try and banish it. Maybe I'm successful, it just takes 6 wounds, it's still alive. Goes around to his turn, I can't try and banish it. So it's just able to rock around and do whatever it wants. That's sort of a big deal. All of those things together that I didn't really understand about manifestations, and that manifestations are just better than I thought, right? Like Kronspine has a lot more wounds, does more damage than I thought any of the manifestations would. I thought they would all look like Quicksilver swords, and they would all do their damage in the combat phase as an activation, and it wouldn't be much damage. Turns out, I misread them. They're really, really powerful, and they're a really big deal. And that chafes a bit against the list building, because every wizard that you take to cast manifestations is another drop. So you really want multicasting wizards and expensive heroes so that you're low drops, and you want to avoid non-wizard heroes just because they'll make you higher drops, and you won't be able to unbind or banish the manifestations, and you won't be able to cast your own manifestations. So seems like they're going to be a big deal. They're going to stick around. Being able to summon them in your opponent's turn is absolutely horrid. Some of them, just the fact that you can put a wall anywhere, you can put them 3 away from an enemy unit is the big deal. A lot of the time you will get a situation where you either summon a manifestation that can't move like directly in front of the enemy, like something like Prismatic Palisade, or you'll summon, not Prismatic Palisade, the Feck one. I'm not sure what it's called, but they have a barricade that stops you moving over it. That's quite brutal. Or just they summon a big base thing like the Gravetide. It just takes up a ton of space, and you can't end your movement on it. And you can't end within 3 of it in your movement phase either. That alone is enough for it to be a really big pain in the ass. Part of the reason this is happening is because coherency had a bigger effect than I was anticipating. I thought coherency would be a big deal, partially because of the nuance about taking casualties. You have to check coherency after every casualty. Pretty much you have to play not just within half an inch of another 2 models in the unit, but you have to play in a tight block formation in base-to-base contact with your unit. And that makes maneuvering around things a bit of a different prospect than it was before. You have to move kind of as a block, and sometimes that's easier, but when you're trying to move around something like a manifestation, actually that can be quite a lot harder. So yeah, all of these little things added together make manifestations actually quite a big deal. There's one more point to mention on manifestations, I think. I made a video about how casting value is not that important. It is kind of for manifestations, because yes, your opponent will still unbind the best ones, but a lot of the time the benefit of a manifestation is just that it exists and is on the board. It's not that important which one you get, it's just that you get something. And so sometimes you'll be casting more spells than your opponent has unbinds, and in that situation, having a lower casting value is actually kind of helpful. All right. There's a lot of anti-X Hordebreakery Monster Slayer and Control Score stuff that when I was reading the rules, I'm not sure how good this will be, because I don't know much about the edition. From playing it, I'm still not seeing it be useful. At some point, I'm going to make a video about situationality in Age of Sigmar. They build all these rules that are very situational, and they don't seem to have like a plan for how they're supposed to interact with the rule system. Just taking those anti-X things as an example, if you have like anti-infantry, anti-cavalry, and anti-monster, and you broadly have these three categories of units, you have infantry, monsters, and cavalry. I guess there are heroes too, but that's perhaps slightly different. If you have these three categories of units, then you kind of have to make a way for them to interact. You have to make a way for them to make sense as their own thing. Like if all infantry were anvils, or if and all the cavalry were hammers, and all the monsters did something else. All right, I'll be back. All right. That was just a visit from the energy saving fairy. I was talking about these horde breakers and the anti-X and the control stuff not really shining through. I don't think I have enough information to fully make a judgment on whether these abilities are good or not, whether the design of them is good or not. But so far, it's looking like not really. Anyway, the terrain rules, I noticed they work really, really well. All of the movement and pile-in stuff, it works together really neatly. The units look good on the battlefield. The coherency stuff makes sense. It can feel a little bit restrictive, but at the same time, moving around the battlefield is a lot less finicky. Getting your units in combat range, seeing what they're in range with, piling in, all that sort of stuff. I think there's a lot less of those little mini games that I personally didn't like very much. I was never a fan of piling out a range of something and making sure they couldn't hit me because their weapon range is only 2 and mine is 3, and all of those tiny little finicky precision things I didn't like about the game. So there's a lot less of that and a lot more of what I would call bigger picture stuff. So that works really well for me. Moving around the terrain and that sort of stuff is part of that. The place of power rule in particular, I think is fantastic. It is a massive upgrade to the mysterious terrain system, like randomly handing out arcane with the rest of the magic system. I think it is really important to have a place of power or to have them be sort of symmetrical, and having those suggested battle plans, having 2 or 4 places of power on them. They just work really neatly in the rules. They give you that unbind or banish option, which is really important. Actually, I'm not sure it's a banish option, but they give you the important unbind option if you do take one of those heroes that's not a wizard. They sort of close the gap between wizard and non-wizard heroes a fair bit. The +1 to cast and pray is really valuable. So a lot of armies, just as a default, it biases the game towards spells succeeding rather than failing, which in general I think they should. Maybe manifestations exempted a bit. I guess one more thing to note about the magic system. A lot of the casting values are up to 7 now. And again, in my video about casting values, I said casting value doesn't really matter, 7 or below. But if you've got a 7 and a -1 to cast because you're using magical intervention, then that 7 makes a big difference. So going from 6 to 7 is important for whether or not you're choosing the spell for a magical intervention. I think that's something that's quite interesting. There's a lot of activation wars. There's a ton of strike first. A lot of it is on a random sort of dice roll, and I'm not sure I like this as a set of rules, but it does mean that to be competitive, a lot of the time you have to play in the activation wars. If your opponent has access to strike first or ways to make you strike last, and you don't have that, then a lot of fights are just not possible for you to do. For example, one of my games I played against Feck. Feck have a way of striking first or making you strike last from Usharan. I think maybe he makes you strike last if he rolls above your control score. So against like Chosen and Knights that I'm playing, he just has to roll a 2+. Not control score, control characteristic. And I'm playing Be'lakor, so I've got when he charges into me, I can, well, not when he charges, just in his combat phase, I can roll a dice for the units, up to 2 units next to Be'lakor, and on a 4-up, they strike first that turn. So he needs to charge with Ushran specifically to be able to get that strike first, so that, or to put strike last on my units, so that if I get strike first, I don't just wipe him out with my Chosen when he charges me. Like, it's really the only way he can effectively deal with a unit of Chosen guarding Be'lakor. It's just so much damage to get with strikes first, and it's too risky to just rely on me not rolling the 4-up. So you just need to be playing in the Activation Wars space. It looks like most armies can, but if you're not, I suppose you better be an army that has some decent shooting or something like that. That's sort of a way of playing in Activation Wars without necessarily having the actual activates first or last sort of thing. But just noticing that's going to be a big deal, especially with counter charges and the weapon ranges and combats being very easy to turn into a big fight at once. You want to charge with a lot of units at once and get a lot of units in combat, because you can't risk your opponent necessarily countercharging into your army and maybe they get strikes first when they charge on a 3-up or something. There's a lot to consider, and a lot of it comes down to anticipating where those the combat sequencing. So if you like that, you'll like that, I suppose. And then the last thing to note is that there are lots of game-breaking abilities that happen on a single die roll. Obviously, Be'lakor is one of these examples. It's not necessarily a single die roll. He gets a lot of die rolls for this, but every time your opponent does something on a 3-up, it doesn't work. Each of those things can be completely game-breaking. One of my games, my opponent picked a battle tactic. They had to get one of their units in combat. I think it's one of the destruction battle tactics. I used the Dark Master on that ability. They needed to get into combat, and it rolled... I rolled badly on its charge roll, so it was able to make a charge roll, but it didn't roll high enough, and then it had to use the command ability to re-roll it. But the new command ability says that the unit uses it, so I get to make a Dark Master roll on the command ability as well, and stopped him from re-rolling it, and that just destroyed the entire battle tactic for him. The first game that I played against Cruel Boys. Cruel Boys have a teleport that can go off on a 2-up, and then they can do it twice. They can actually roll a 2-up, and then they've got to back up a 3-up if they take the sub-faction called like Lightfinger or something. So if you pick a unit to destroy, that unit, that can just teleport away. You can just teleport to the edge of the battlefield or something. And his general had Sneaky Scumbag, so that just retreats on a 3-up out of combat. Like I said earlier in the video, Furies could have that sort of ability. There's a lot of abilities that make battle tactics very, very likely to fail on a 3-up. And those are the sort of thing, like in Cruel Boys, you can cover so much of your army. Any infantry unit can use that teleporting ability, and then you can have this retreat on your general. So there's so few units in your entire army, especially like you have your general and then all of your general's regiment are infantry. It's just impossible to get that battle tactic. And so like if you pick it, you just lose it by default. So there's lots of those situations, lots of those single die roll for really, really, really powerful effects. And even some of those are like just how big a deal some of the manifestations can be. Yeah, I'm not sure I like how swingy that is. That's probably just new edition balance and that sort of thing. But yeah, those are my first impressions. I didn't want to make this video too long because I have to record the Stormcast supplemental, and I got to get onto Slaves to Darkness, Faction Focus. I've done up a whole marking rubric. I just want to quickly give you like the look of this. Yeah, I've done Stormcast a bit dirty because they won't get to use the marking rubric, but I'm going to go through and actually mark the rules in some sort of coherent way, so at the end we can compare the different factions and how well designed, at least I think they are. But yeah, that's the update. That's how my games went on the weekend. Curious to see what other people think about this, because I only played 3 or 4 games, and it really depends on what you take to the games and what you played against for how those things feel. And in particular, if you've got an opinion on, what is it, the control score stuff and the like horde breakers and the anti-X, if that system really works for you, if you're like, well, yeah, I had this, I've got anti-cavalry, and he had anti-infantry cavalry, so I made sure to get my anti-cavalry to charge his anti-infantry cavalry, and I had the advantage in that fight. It was really interesting to me. Or like, there was this situation where we had a bunch of units on the control point, but I had these control score modifier things, and that was winning me the table. Things like that would be interesting for me to hear, because I just did not get that in my games. The control score stuff didn't matter. The anti-X stuff wasn't a big deal. The Horde Breaker and the Monster Slayer stuff just didn't show up. It's like in every book, and I see it in a lot of the rules, but I'm just not seeing it matter that much. So, yep, I'm going to leave it there, and I'll see you in the next one.